This is Ireland, where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea. And things don't change much up here, away from it all where the wind blows. And it's where this story starts, and ends, too, if these things ever end. For this story has that simple truth about it. At the beginning of this century, and this place has seen many a hard winter and forgotten summer's days since then, a little lad used to come up here on his holidays, and here he savored alone the bittersweet longing for desire, which he later called joy, for he knew it to be an experience common in a greater or lesser extent to all men. This story testifies to that joy, and tells of the man who came to know it for what it was, who gave it the familiar ring of truth. That little lad, you see, was C.S. Lewis, destined to become one of the finest champions of the Christian faith, one man who glanced through joy and beyond. These are the Hollywood Hills, rising above the city of Belfast, Northern Ireland. And it was to these hills and their solitude that Lewis used to come. Over there on the horizon are the Antrim Mountains, on a summer's day, a uniform mass of grayish blue. I'm Walter Hooper, and Lewis's private secretary, for a while near the end of his life. You see, I knew him as a kindly old professor and a fine Christian. But it wasn't always that way. Indeed, he described himself in his youth as having been a self-righteous prig. And certainly through the whole of his life, even after conversion, he was never Puritan. The story which we're about to set forth is of that life. And as you'll see, it's an interesting one. Clive Staples Lewis was born in Dundela Villas on the outskirts of Belfast on the 29th of November, 1898. His father, Albert Lewis, was of Welsh farming stock and had a successful law practice in Belfast. In 1894, he married Flora Hamilton, the daughter of the local rector of St. Mark's Church in Dundela. Flora was a cool-headed woman, with a first in mathematics from Queen's College, Belfast. After a brief honeymoon, they settled here in Dundela Villas. Their first son, Warren, or Warney, is the little lad seated on the left. He came along about a year after the marriage, and 3 years after that, he was followed by Clive Staples, or Jack, as he preferred to be called from the age of 4 onwards, shown here standing in white with their mother at the back. In 1905, when Lewis was 7, the first great change in his life occurred. His father, with increasing prosperity, had the new house built. It is a large house called Little Lea, and still stands way out in what was then the country, and the Lewis boys liked it. As Lewis later wrote in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy,
I am the product of long corridors, empty, sunlit rooms, upstairs, indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles, also of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in the bedrooms, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me, as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass.
Jack and Warnie were as close as ever, for these were the golden years before all the changes. Often, Big and Little Brother would set off on their bicycles and seek a way into the rural quiet, with thoughts of a chance meeting with a knight in full plate or a leprechaun with a pot of gold. They went, you see, in search of things which had beauty, something strangely absent in their own home.
This absence of beauty, now that I come to think of it, is characteristic of our childhood. And no picture on the walls of my father's house ever attracted, and indeed none deserved, our attention. We never saw a beautiful building, nor imagined that a building could be beautiful. My earliest aesthetic experiences, if indeed they were aesthetic, were not of that kind. They were already incurably romantic, not formal. Once, in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin, which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers, so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden.
The house is indeed spacious, and when the Irish weather drove them inside, this, the little end room, was their favorite, and the place where they came to make things and be away from everyone. They both suffered from a manual clumsiness owing to an inherited deformity of the thumb. Rather than make castles and ships, Lewis was forced to describe them. The result was his stories of the imaginary world of Boxen, with characters like James Barr, a bear, Magula, a horse, Viscount Puttyfat, an owl, Their Majesties Benjamin the Sixth and Hawkey the Fourth, both rabbits, and most endearing of all, there is Lord Big, the Little Master or Prime Minister, who is a frog of powerful personality.
In my daydreams, I was training myself to be a fool. In mapping and chronicling Boxen, I was training myself to be a novelist.
Here is an example of some late Boxoniana with Lewis's own drawings, done when he was about 10 years old. Lewis was later to write of his childhood.
It will be clear that I was living almost entirely in my imagination, or at least that the imaginative experience of those years now seems to me more important than anything else. The first is itself the memory of a memory. As I stood beside a flowering bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me, without warning, and as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, The memory of that earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even for my own past. The second glimpse came through Squirrel Nutkin. Through it only, although I loved all the Beatrix Potter books. But it administered the shock. It was a trouble. It troubled me with what I can only describe as the idea of autumn. The experience was one of intense desire, and in the experience also there was the same surprise and the same sense of incalculable importance. The third glimpse came through poetry. I had become fond of Longfellow's saga of King Olaf, fond of it in a casual, shallow way for its story and its vigorous rhythms. But then, and quite different from such pleasures, and like a voice from far more distant regions, there came a moment when I idly turned the pages of the book and found the unrhymed translation of Tainer's Drapa and read, "I heard a voice that cried, Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead." I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described, except that it is cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it.
While Warnie had been sent to school in England as far back as 1905, Jack was still here at home taking lessons from his governess and his mother. Indeed, he had considerable knowledge of both Greek and Latin by the age of 6. Then, in the winter of 1908, Flora began to feel ill. She was operated on here at home shortly afterwards. And the youngest son was never to forget how, after the operation, his father, in tears, came into his room and tried to convey the news that his mother had cancer. Warnie was called home from England, and like two frightened urchins huddled for warmth in a bleak world, their mother, who before had set the even temper of the family, was gradually withdrawn from them. Before her death, she presented each of her sons with a Bible.
With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.
Although Albert Lewis's intentions were good, bad advice from the start meant that Lewis's early school life was disastrous. He hated all of the schools he was forced to attend, the first being Wynyard School in Watford, or Belson, as Lewis was later to call it, just northwest of London. It was run by a crazed headmaster who wielded the cane at the slightest provocation. But after 2 brutalizing years, the headmaster was certified insane, and the school collapsed. There was, however, one good effect to come out of this debacle. The boys were sent regularly to this church, St. John's, still a fine bastion of Anglo-Catholicism. It was here that Lewis, for the first time, heard the doctrines of Christianity taught by men who really believed them.
As I had no skepticism, the effect was to bring to life what I would already have said that I believed. In this experience, there was a great deal of fear. I feared for my soul, especially on certain blazing moonlight nights in that curtainless dormitory. How the sound of other boys breathing in their sleep comes back.
After the collapse of Wynyard, Warnie was old enough to be sent on to Malvern College, one of the finest old schools in England. But for Jack, it was to Campbell College, just a few miles from his home on the outskirts of Belfast. This was 1910. A little later, he was here at Cherbourg School, perched high upon the beautiful Malvern Hills, overlooking Malvern College. It's much the same in appearance now as it was in 1911, when Lewis was here. And for 2 years, his education began in earnest, under the kind and sensible guidance of the headmaster, Arthur C. Allen. Meanwhile, terrible harm was coming to the lad from an unexpected quarter. The school matron, Miss G.E. Cowie, well-intentioned though she was, her floundering in the mazes of theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and spiritualism smothered what truth of Christian revelation he had so far received, and left the boy a self-confessed and rejoicing atheist.
Little by little, unconsciously, unintentionally, she loosened the whole framework, blunted all the sharp edges of my belief. The vagueness, the merely speculative character of all this occultism began to spread. Yes, and to spread deliciously to the stern truths of the creed. And, oh, the relief of it. Those moonlit nights in the dormitory at Belsen faded far away. From the tyrannous noon of revelation, I passed into the cool evening twilight of higher thought, where there was nothing to be obeyed, nothing to be believed except what was either comforting or exciting.
But Lewis persevered as a scholar, and at the end of summer term 1913, he won a classical scholarship to Malvern College. Allowed to name his own prize, he was given a copy of Donald A. Mackenzie's Teutonic Myth and Legend. For it was clear now that the vast, cool northernness in Norse mythology was his greatest literary love. This is Malvern College, overlooking the whole of Worcestershire and beyond. It was to here Lewis came in September 1913. And if he had been the only pupil, he would have found the library and many of the masters all he could have wanted. In this dormitory, and in one of these very beds, Lewis spent many sleepless and tormented nights. At times exhausted, he pleaded with his father for the whole of the time he was here to have him removed. Until that could take place, however, if it ever would, he clung under the only life raft he knew, literature, especially the mythology. School organization brought only deeply felt melancholy, and for solace he retreated into a many-islanded sea of poetry and myth.
I can lay my hand on the very moment. There is hardly any fact I know so well. Someone must have left in the schoolroom a literary periodical, The Bookman. My eye fell upon a headline and a picture carelessly, expecting nothing. A moment later, as the poet says, the sky had turned round. What I had read were the words, Siegfried and the twilight of the gods. Pure northernness engulfed me, a vision of huge, clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic in the endless twilight of northern summer, remoteness, severity. And almost at the same moment I knew that I had met this before, long, long ago, in Taina's Drapa. That Siegfried belonged to the same world as Balder and the sunward sailing cranes. And with that plunge back into my own past, there arose at once, almost like heartbreak, the memory of joy itself, the knowledge that I had once had, what I had now lacked for years, that I was returning at last from exile and desert lands to my own country, and the distance of the twilight of the gods and the distance of my own past joy, both unattainable, flowed together into a single unendurable sense of desire and loss. And at once I knew that to have it again was the supreme and only important object of desire.
Though his father had received no unflattering reports of these schools from the elder, more gregarious son Warren, he was now convinced that the younger boy's pessimism was not feigned. The schools were causing him considerable damage, and something had to be done. During the Easter vacation of 1914, his father wrote to William T. Kirkpatrick, who had been his headmaster when Albert Lewis was a pupil at Lurgan College, and asked him to tutor Jack. Kirkpatrick, then 66 and living in the wilds of Surrey, was taking one or two boarding pupils, and as he had already prepared Warren for Sandhurst, he consented to cram Lewis for Oxford. The one condition he insisted on was that Jack return to Malvern for one final term, and then come to him in the autumn of 1914. But this wasn't the only pleasant thing of that Easter vacation, and it happened here in this house with a Gaelic name, Burnagh. While at home, Lewis wondered whether he should walk across the road and meet a chap who had long wanted to become his friend, Arthur Greaves. Their families were friends. Arthur was ill, and a message had been sent to say that Arthur would welcome a visit. Lewis rarely accepted such a summons. Everyone in the house knew that. But with the end of his school days in sight, his day-to-day melancholy was for once lifted, and he accepted. One ponders, this meeting could easily never have taken place, and a lifelong friendship would never have been realized.
I found Arthur sitting up in bed. On the table beside him lay a copy of Myths of the Norsemen. "Do you like that?" said I. "Do you like that?" said he. Next moment the book was in our hands. Our heads were bent close together. We were pointing, quoting, talking, soon almost shouting, discovering in a torrent of questions that we liked not only the same thing, but the same parts of it, and in the same way, that both knew the stab of joy, and that for both the arrow was shot from the north. Nothing, I suspect, is more astonishing in any man's life than the discovery that there do exist people very, very like himself.
Lewis had every reason to feel happy and excited about this new friendship, for now his visits home, even during inclement Irish weather, became a pleasure rather than a chore. And yet the two were very different. Greaves, an inarticulate Christian believer, and Lewis, the high-flown, silver-tongued atheist. Lewis was later to write about his friend, "I learned charity from him, but for all my efforts failed to teach him arrogance in return." And so in the autumn of 1914, he came here to the home of William T. Kirkpatrick, the Great Knock, as the Lewises always called him, in the Surrey village of Little Bookham. The house, which is gone now, was called Gaston's, but the 200-year-old barn still stands. It was here that Lewis's intellect was rescued from what might have been gradual dissipation, and for the rest of his life he was grateful for it. No less a part of his happiness with the Great Knock were Lewis's daily walks through the surrounding countryside. This rural beauty of Surrey effectively ended Lewis's quarrel with England. He said of the Great Knock,
If ever a man came near to being a purely logical entity, that man was Kirkpatrick. The idea that human beings should exercise their vocal organs for any purpose except that of communicating or discovering truth was to him preposterous. The most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. Some boys would not have liked it. To me, it was red beef and strong beer. Here was talk that was really about something. Here was a man who thought not about you, but about what you said. No doubt I snorted and bridled a little at some of my tossings, but taking it all in all, I loved the treatment. After being knocked down sufficiently often, I began to know a few guards and blows and to put on intellectual muscle. In the end, unless I flatter myself, I became a not contemptible sparring partner. It was a great day when the man who had so long been engaged in exposing my vagueness at last cautioned me against the dangers of excessive subtlety.
but respect flowed mutually between them. And of Lewis, Kirkpatrick, not a man to bandy compliments with a pupil, said in a letter to Albert Lewis of the 16th September 1915 that Clive Lewis was the most brilliant translator of Greek plays he had ever met. For Lewis, the days at Little Bookham were paradisal without qualification, his letters of the time being charged with the intoxication of literary discovery. And so, with Kirkpatrick's encouragement, on to Oxford.
It is well that there are places of peace and discipline and dreaming and desire, lest we forget our heritage and cease the Spirit's work to hunger and aspire.
This is University College, founded in 1280, the oldest of all the 35 colleges in Oxford, where Lewis was now a scholar. When he arrived here on the 26th April, 1917, he was shown to a set of rooms here in Radcliffe Quad, staircase 12, room 5. Those are the rooms he occupied during his entire residence at University College, or Univ, and there's very little changed. In fact, the view is exactly the same, and one which Lewis enjoyed especially. He wrote of it in a letter to Arthur Greaves.
It is getting to be quite homely to me, this room, especially when I come back to it by firelight and find the kettle boiling. How I love kettles.
But it has to be remembered that this, sadly, was Oxford in wartime. In fact, there were only 12 men in unit at the time, and in this photograph we see Lewis in the far right-hand corner. There were still chaps swimming in the Charwell, still a few punts on the river, but on the whole, things were greatly changed. Even though he was a determined atheist at this time, Lewis was never a man to live a lie. And whilst he took a scholarship in the foremost English university, he now felt duty-bound to take his place in her armed forces. He didn't have to sign up. His father actively deterred him from doing so. As an Irish subject, Lewis could easily have gained exemption. But in this, he just felt duty-bound. And so, in June of 1917, he moved across the university from Univ to be billeted here in Keble College with the Officers' Training Corps. He shared a room with EFC Paddy Moore. Paddy's home was in Bristol, and his mother and sister came down and took temporary lodgings in Oxford to be near him. This chance meeting was to have great effect on the rest of Lewis's life. The young men grew fast friends, and 2 surviving photographs from those days of tense expectancy show them with their battalion. And again here punting on the river. But it had to come to an end sooner or later, they knew that. And on the 18th of September, they learned that there were just 4 weeks left before possibly going to the front. The Moores lived here in 56 Ravenswood Road, Bristol. And it was here that Jack and Paddy were to be together for the last time before being shipped to France. Lewis with the Somerset Light Infantry, and Paddy with his Rifle Brigade. And it was during this time that Paddy's sister Maureen witnessed Lewis and Paddy promise most solemnly that if one or other of them survived the war, the survivor would look after Paddy's mother and Lewis's father. Suddenly, on Thursday, the 15th November, they were ordered to the front following a 48-hour leave. He reached the front line on his 19th birthday, the 29th November. Lewis didn't find out until later that his friend Paddy was killed in March 1918. And indeed, the war for Lewis was not to last much longer. After capturing a small company of Germans single-handed, which he later claimed was more accident than angry aggression, they weren't really afraid of me, but just walked out with their hands up. He was wounded during the Battle of Arras on the 15th April from an English shell which burst behind him. He was now to convalesce in a number of cluttered military hospitals. And when he arrived back in London on the 25th May, 1918, he began compiling Spirits in Bondage under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton, a volume of poems which he hoped would be his first step towards poetic fame. For him, more than for many others, Byron's words, "I will cut myself a path through this world or perish in the attempt. I will achieve grandeur, but never with dishonor," were despairingly true. Indeed, it was on this that his atheism thrived so vehemently. And what a formidable atheist he was. He wrote to his friend Arthur Greeves,
"You know, I think that I believe in no religion. There is no proof for any of them, and from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention. Of course, mind you, I'm not laying down as a certainty that there is nothing outside the material world. This would be foolish."
So Lewis returned to the dreaming spires of Oxford in January of 1919. And within 2 months, he was already a published poet. He was determined that there be no flirtations with the idea of the supernatural. All the images he associated with joy were, he concluded, sheer fantasies. He had at last seen through them. The important thing was to get ahead with the good life, and where better than Oxford? Well, Lewis's confusions at the time must be taken for what they were. But at least now, with the war over, his undergraduate days began in earnest, and with them his pledged responsibility for Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen. After fulfilling 2 more terms of statutory residence in Univ, he, with the Moores, decided to take rented accommodations in Headington to the east of the university. And this saw the beginning of many unsettling years of domestic drudgery and worry. Not only was the allowance from his father not sufficient for a man with 2 total dependents to live in flats such as these, but the whole thing brought unnecessary frustration at a time when his studies demanded his undivided attention. In fact, it wasn't for many years after repeated flittings and arguments with landladies that Lewis, with Mrs. Moore and her daughter, settled in this house, the Kilns, with its pond and woodlands in the village of Headington Quarry. In spite of his domestic burden, Lewis's academic work prospered, though, and much of it was done here in the Bodleian Library.
I spend all my mornings in the Bodleian. I sit in Duke Humphrey's library, the oldest part, a 15th century building with a very beautiful wooden painted ceiling above me, and a little mullioned window on my left hand, through which I look down on the garden of Exeter College, where in the spring I see the sudden squalls of wind and rain driving the first blossoms off the fruit trees and snowing the lawn with them.
Unlike many establishments, a man's Oxford career is assessed in just several days of continuous and rigorous examination. This ordeal is carried on here in this building, the dreaded schools. Lewis was to sample this treatment several times, for after taking a double first in Greats, that is classic and philosophy, he set his sights on a college fellowship and took a brilliant first in English just the very next year in 1923. Before the year was out, he had applied for several fellowships, but the only one offered him was a fellowship in English language and literature at Magdalen College, and he accepted it. He wrote to his father,
I'm rather glad of the change. I have come to think that if I had the mind, I have not the brain and nerves for a life of pure philosophy. A continued search among the abstract roots of things, a perpetual questioning of all that plain men take for granted, chewing the cud for 50 years over inevitable ignorance, and a constant frontier watch on the little tidy, lighted, conventional world of science and daily life. Is this the best life for temperaments such as ours?
By 1925, Lewis's financial worries were finally over, for now he was tutoring in his own right and a full member of the senior common room. These are Lewis's rooms in Magdalen, and it's here where he gave his tutorials or tutes. His bedroom was beyond that door. From this window he enjoyed a view of the famous deer park. And in his other room he could look through his window down under the croquet lawn beneath. It was here that Lewis entertained his friends, Owen Barfield, the lawyer, Professor J.R.R. Tolkien, Hugo Dyson, the English tutor at Merton, Dr. Robert Havard, his physician, Charles Williams, the novelist, Lord David Cecil, Lewis's brother Warney, and others. They later formed themselves into the literary group known as the Inklings. Before long, things started to come to a head for Lewis. As a man who believed in the essential economy of nature, the existence of joy as distinct from pleasure had always troubled him. What was it? Where could he place his finger and say, "This is it"? He couldn't. Slowly but surely, his intellect was being bullied into the corner, and he knew it.
I was going up Headington Hill on the top of a bus. Without words and almost without images, a fact about myself was somehow presented to me. I became aware that I was holding something at bay, or shutting something out.
This had been no straight road as to Damascus, more like a schoolboy's meanderings home. Yet the destination was the same. An urgent dispatch to his friend Barfield read,
Terrible things are happening to me. The spirit, or real I, is showing an alarming tendency to become much more personal, and is taking the offensive and behaving just like God. You'd better come on Monday at the latest, or I may have entered a monastery.
And so it had happened.
You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. The prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet, but who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The words compelle intrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them, but properly understood, they plumb the depth of the divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation.
But Lewis was still only a theist. And it was one Saturday evening, the 19th September, 1931, when Lewis invited J.R.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson to dine, that the final piece fell into place, here, as the three of them strolled along Addison's Walk. Immediately afterwards, he wrote this to his friend Arthur Greeves.
What Dyson and Tolkien showed me was that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. Again, that if I met the idea of a god sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much and was mysteriously moved by it. Again, that the idea of the dying and reviving God similarly moved me, provided I met it anywhere except in the Gospels. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with this tremendous difference, that it really happened.
A few days later, Lewis was to draw his final conclusions to the whole episode. He and his brother took a picnic lunch to Whipsnade Zoo on the outskirts of London in Warney's motorcycle and sidecar.
When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did. It was like when a man, after a long sleep, still lying motionless in bed, becomes aware that he is now awake. And what, in conclusion, of joy? It was a pointer to something other and outer. When we are lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. He who first sees it cries, "Look!" The whole party gathers around and stares. But when we have found the road and are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us, and we shall be grateful to the authority that set them up. But we shall not stop and stare, not on this road, though their pillars are of silver and their lettering of gold. We would be at Jerusalem.
Lewis was now entering the busiest period of his life. As a Christian, the shackles of ambition fell away. It didn't matter to him anymore that he was a failed poet. He now had something very important to say, and was eager to get on writing about the things he most enjoyed. His highly readable study in medieval tradition, The Allegory of Love, caused him to be fast recognized as the greatest literary scholar of his generation. Shortly afterwards, there poured from his pen his science fiction trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength, in which he discovered that any amount of theology can be smuggled into people's heads under the cover of romance without their knowing it. Beginning in the late 1930s, special friends gathered around Lewis. It started with Tolkien on Monday mornings as far back as 1931, and gathered momentum through the years until by 1939 there were regular Inkling meetings here in Magdalen every Thursday evening during term time. Warney, or Major Lewis as he was after 20 years in the Army, retired in 1930 to live with his brother at the Kilns. When, at the outbreak of World War II, he was called into active service, Jack kept him informed about the activities of the club. Writing to him in November of 1939, he said,
"On Thursday we had a meeting of the Inklings. I have never in my life seen Dyson so exuberant, a roaring cataract of nonsense. The bill of fare consisted of a section of the new Hobbit book from Tolkien, a nativity play from Charles Williams, unusually intelligible for him and approved by all, and a chapter out of a book on the problem of pain from me. The subject matter of the three readings formed almost a logical sequence and produced a really first-rate evening's talk of the usual wide-ranging kind, from grave to gay, from lively to severe."
The new Hobbit book of which he spoke was The Lord of the Rings. Like many of the manuscripts read aloud at the Thursday evening gatherings, it too was sometimes discussed at other meetings of the Inklings held on Tuesday mornings in the Eagle and Child pub, or the Bird and Baby, as it is better known. Following the publication of Lewis's Problem of Pain, the director of religious broadcasting of the BBC asked him to do a series of talks over the radio in 1942. Lewis accepted because he regarded England as part of that vast post-Christian world which thought it had rejected Christianity, when in truth it had never been told what it is about. These talks were afterwards published as Mere Christianity. Ignoring the slush taught by liberal theologians, Lewis said,
I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God.
That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic, on a level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to.
In between broadcasts, Lewis was traveling all over the country, lecturing to the Royal Air Force. And in Oxford, he answered the demands of those who were clamoring for an open forum for discussing the intellectual difficulties connected with Christianity. The Socratic Club was formed in 1942, and Lewis was elected president. They pinned up posters such as this in every college. During the meeting, Christians and atheists were both given a chance to argue the pros and cons of the Christian religion. On these occasions, Lewis was the gladiator, and he could always be depended upon to uphold orthodox supernatural Christianity. And students flocked to watch him wipe the floor with any liberal or atheist intrepid enough to step into the arena with him. Perhaps the greatest accolade given Lewis was the invitation to preach the university sermon here in the 13th century church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. This is the pulpit from which he delivered that sermon, The Weight of Glory. And to a packed church, with people even in the windows, Lewis's words on the 8th June 1941 were beyond anyone's expectation.
There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendor. Next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way, for in him also Christ vere latitat. The glorifier and the glorified, glory himself, is truly hidden.
This is his parish church out at Headington Quarry. And it was here, following an 8 a.m. communion service, that the book which brought him international fame was conceived. Writing to his brother Warren, he said,
After the service was over, I was struck by an idea for a book, which I think might be both useful and entertaining. It would be called As One Devil to Another, and would consist of letters from an elderly retired devil to a young devil who has just started work on his first patient. The idea would be to give all the psychology of temptation from the other point of view.
The Screwtape Letters now soars with the classics. And yet, knowing this, Lewis, with typical humility, said, Many have paid me an undeserved compliment in supposing that my letters were the ripe fruit of many years' study in moral and ascetic theology. They forgot that there is an equally reliable, though less creditable, way of learning how temptation works. My heart, I need no others, showeth me the wickedness of the ungodly. This is the mill pond at the back of Addison's Walk, where Lewis walked with Tolkien and Dyson on that wild and windy night of his conversion. Daily now he took this route home, where increasingly his problems mounted. Mrs. Moore, whom he had looked after for more than 30 years, was seriously ill and soon to die. And as for Warney, he was fast sliding into serious alcoholism. Yet with all this, Lewis continued to write well. Not only fine pieces of literature, but day-to-day letters to those who wrote to him, even to the day of his death. Every letter was answered by return of post, often with more care than was lavished on the inquiry. For him, writing was his recreation, his solace, as natural as breathing. And without turning his back on any of his troubles, he produced some of the most pleasant books of his whole career, the Chronicles of Narnia. They were the unexpected creation of his middle age, and seemed to be his greatest claim to immortality, setting him high in that particular branch of literature in which few attain more than a transitory or an esoteric fame. The final of the 7 books, The Last Battle, won the Carnegie Medal. The central character in all the stories, the great royal lion Aslan, was Lewis's answer to the question, what might the Son of God be like if he appeared in Narnia, as he actually has in our own world? In November 1954, Lewis was elected professor of medieval and Renaissance literature here in Cambridge. By a most pleasant coincidence, the chair was attached to this college, also called Magdalen, where he was a fellow. Those were his rooms over there on the first floor of this 15th century college. And for the next 9 years, whilst living in the kilns at Oxford, he was driven on Mondays to spend his working week at this other Magdalen. His election had been unanimous, not one dissenting vote, for the chair was founded with him in view as the first occupant. I have exchanged the impenitent for the penitent Magdalen, Lewis described the change, and indeed it was one of the happiest decisions of his career. It was in 1952 that Lewis first met Joy Davidman. She had ambitions as a writer and had long admired Lewis. Leaving her husband, William Gresham, and her 2 small sons in her native New York, she came over to see him. And thus began one of the strangest episodes of Lewis's life. Having been in this country for over a year, she returned to New York, where her husband divorced her. Then it was back to England again and Lewis, this time with her 2 sons. Although Lewis had no romantic feeling for her, he took pity on her plight when she discovered that the Home Office refused to renew her passport. It was therefore charity on his part when he agreed to go through a civil marriage ceremony to keep her in this country. But he remained adamant. The reality, he wrote to his old friend Arthur Greaves, would be adultery, and therefore mustn't happen. And so they simply lived apart, Joy moving to this house in Headington. Yet there was more to come, for after falling and breaking a leg which had long given her pain, they discovered that she was fast dying of cancer. This made things different, and although he insisted that the marriage never be made complete, it was thought that an ecclesiastical ceremony was necessary to avoid possible scandal. So they were married on the ward of the Nuffield Hospital on the 21st March, 1957. And shortly afterwards, Joy was moved as planned to the kilns, where Lewis cared for her. In fact, Joy Davidman survived just another 3 years, and indeed was to bring Lewis much happiness, for their love was one that grew from adversity. As he said to Neville Coghill,
I never expected to have in my 60s the happiness that passed me by in my 20s.
In fact, I first met him early in 1963, and as we became more intimate, he asked me to become his companion secretary, and I moved here into the kilns. He was suffering from a combination of illnesses, and the doctors told us there was a strong possibility that he could live for years or die at any moment. I see myself, he told me, as a sentinel on duty. I'm willing to stay until I'm called, but mind, I'd sooner be called. Meanwhile, as it looked as if Jack would live for several more years, we got on with our work. The Monday morning inkling meetings, the pints of beer, the steady conversations over cups of tea, and all the rest. They were happy times indeed, with Paxford the gardener, Mrs. Miller the housekeeper, and most of all Lewis with his irrepressible fun. But as Jack's health was indeed worsening, Warney returned from Ireland to look after him. Warney wrote later in his memoirs of his brother Jack, "Once again, as in the earliest days, we could turn for comfort only to each other. The wheel had come full circle. Once again we were together in the little end room at home, shutting out from our talk the ever-present knowledge that the holidays were ending, that a new term fraught with unknown possibilities awaited us both." Jack faced the prospect bravely and calmly. "I have done all I wanted to do, and I'm ready to go," he said to me one evening. Our talk tended to be cheerfully reminiscent during the last days. Long-forgotten incidents in our shared past would be remembered, and the old Jack would return for a moment whimsical and witty. We were recapturing the old schoolboy technique of extracting the last drop of juice from our holidays. Recalling the final day of Jack's life, Warney went on to write, "Friday, the 22nd of November, 1963, began much as other days. There was breakfast, then letters and the crossword puzzle. After lunch, he fell asleep in his chair. I suggested that he would be more comfortable in bed, and he went there. At 4, I took in his tea and found him drowsy but comfortable. Our few words then were the last. At 5:30, I heard a crash and ran in to find him lying unconscious at the foot of his bed. He ceased to breathe some 3 or 4 minutes later. The following Friday would have been his 65th birthday."
Then Aslan turned to them and said, "You are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over. The holidays have begun. The dream is ended. This is the morning. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they lived happily ever after." But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before.